Happy Thursday, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Cloud Foundry Weekly. How you doing, Nick?
I'm doing great. Great to be back. I'm back adjusted to my local time zone from Germany. So that was another great trip out there. And really, if you haven't seen the show last week, you should go check it out. We did a live show from Cloud Foundry Day, EU 2024. So I'm just processing that and looking forward to our guest today.
So two things that really come back to me from Cloud Foundry Day and EU last week was one, a lot of excitement. And we had like 160 people there. The room was packed. We had some really good talks. The second major thing that came from me is that as I get older, jet lag is a thing. Man, kicked my butt while we were there. But from a show perspective, we'll put in the show notes down there the links to all the videos if you didn't get to see them. But they've all been posted now from Cloud Foundry and the Linux Foundation. Those are out on the web. I suggest everybody go out and watch them. There were some great talks, talking about the renaissance of how Cloud Foundry is kind of going through a renaissance and coming back. A lot of new projects coming out of SAP and some other teams. So we'll make sure and link those in the show notes. So let's make sure you go take a look at that. Anything from you that really stuck out for you, Nick?
So I like when some of the I can't remember who's someone from SAP, like they have like one of the first sessions, but they asked if anybody was new to the community.
Yeah.
And like both at Karlsruhe and at Heidelberg, there's a significant number of people raised their hands of new people had never been to a Cloud Foundry event before. So it's just good to see the continued growth and just all the a lot of the new revival of some projects like Stratos or just new projects coming out within the community. So pretty cool to see that happening, and I'm excited for the future.
Sure. Yeah, I was excited about, you got 520 and Any9's getting together to bring back the Stratos UI for the open source side. That was pretty exciting. Also, let's talk about the new slogan for Cloud Foundry. It just runs.
Yes,
so simple,
yeah.
But man, is that powerful, because this is something we've talked about on the show. It just runs.
Yeah, I need to get some of those shirts. That's for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, so we're coming back today. So we've got this reoccurring series that we do with David Zendzian, DMZ, into the DMZ. We're going to be talking security today. DMZ is going to be bringing on a special guest with him. You want to introduce?
Sure. Yeah. So we have Chris Cropper coming on to the stage, and DMZ. So we are going to do another security themed, compliance related show today. And I guess Chris, since you're new to the podcast or the show, we'll start out with you. One, give a bit of an intro to yourself, and then we want to start with your if you remember your first CF push experience as well.
All right. Hey, thanks, Nikki. Great to be here. DMZ, always a pleasure. It's good to spend some time chatting with you all today. My name is Chris Cropper. Come from a primarily DoD background, just shy of 18 years serving in the Army, and then now working as a mostly defense contractor, doing RMF compliance work for about close to 6 years now. And actually my first time encountering Cloud Foundry and really Tanzu as a whole was about 8 months, a year or so into that time as a contractor. I actually was working as a security manager for a DoD customer, highly focused on innovation, that wanted to bring Cloud Foundry and Tanzu into their environment and do a pilot program to get an accreditation for, at the time, let's see, it just shifted from Pivotal Labs to VMware, but wanted to do a pilot program, an accreditation of an ATO, which is an authorization to operate. And for those listening that are maybe not as familiar with the compliance world, that essentially means that the DoD or public sector has given an authorization for either a software product or an entire ecosystem, such as a Tanzu infrastructure, including Cloud Foundry, to be used in the environment for a set amount of time. And so, again, not a VMware employee at the time, but had a wonderful experience just kind of going back and forth with the team, better understanding the role of Cloud Foundry and Tanzu, the application service and the catalog, and how it interacted with the cloud infrastructure, and then ultimately working towards that authorization. And so it was a wonderful experience. And it was neat because they actually came in initially. It was a good teaching experience because a lot of the folks that I worked with had not done an authorization. Again, it's not something that's well known necessarily in the commercial world, but had not done this type of ATO. So I was able to have a wonderful back and forth for about 6 months, learn a lot of what makes Cloud Foundry tick from a compliance standpoint, and then validate that it was secure and it was a fantastic use case for the DoD, which culminated in that authorization. And then 6 months later, with me becoming a part of this team. So I feel like it's a great first story and kind of first experience with it.
Yeah. Well, and shout out to Rita. So she just threw up a blog entry on the continuous authority to authorization to operate there. We'll make sure that we get that in the show notes for anybody that wants to take a look at it. But let's dig into that ATO for a little bit. So, one of the primary, we've got several federal customers that use Cloud Foundry. And one of the reasons that they do that is because they can get the ATO on the platform, at least from my understanding, and hoping you can dig into this a little bit more, Chris. But they get the authority to operate with the platform, which automatically kind of gives, authority for the applications that are existing on that platform. It kind of streamlines this process so that they're able to get applications out there faster. Can you kind of jump into maybe how Cloud Foundry helps with ATO and why that's such a big benefit for our customers?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to do so. So the original model of getting an authorization was centered around 3 tiers, literally tiers 1, 2, and 3. And so the DoD often approached authorization from the perspective of seeing, so tier 1 being like the highest level DoD, think policies, right? Because there's definitely policies in the process. So tier 1 is going to be a ton of policies that are overarching for the entire DoD, which if you think about it, that's over 2 million people between the different military branches, the public sector. It's huge, absolutely huge. So it makes sense that there should be overarching guidance on a lot of these things. Tier 2 is going to be more closer to home. So let's say you're in an Army system. So tier 2 is going to be that level. It's the component. It's what is unique. It will never change what's coming from that higher level, but it'll be more specific to that service branch. And then tier 3 is where we're focused, and that is often where pretty much 100% of the technical controls come into play, as well as some unique policies. Let's think of an organ. TRADOC is well known to a lot of people. That's the training command for the Army. So there might be a lot of policies that are specific only to training to that section of the Army. So a typical authorization has anywhere from 1,600 to 2,100 controls or questions. Think of it that way. This is, a lot of people will talk about a spreadsheet, and this is the infamous spreadsheet that we're talking about. So let's say there's 2,000 questions that are all about the configuration of your system and all of those policies. So this is where, from a compliance standpoint, we get into the weeds of how is something configured. So again, real quick, 3 tiers. Tier 3 is where at least half of those controls are. So here's where Cloud Foundry and our infrastructure come into play and benefit from that. So of those 2,000-ish questions, there's probably about 600 or 700 that are technical. Now, an application should not have to answer those 700 questions, but the legacy approach does. It requires applications to do that. Where Cloud Foundry are, and then our orchestration, all of our different layers of that tier 3 come into play, is we simplify that. One of the customers that I'm working with, we've been able to take that 600 or 700 questions and using a robust inheritance. Again, for those not familiar, inheritance is what we call that term where some higher layer in the infrastructure meets the security requirements for a lower layer. So from an application perspective, I've seen a team be reduced all the way down to 38 questions from that original 2,000. And so that's huge. Go ahead.
Yeah, if you want, so these layers may not make sense. If you don't live in the policy and compliance world, the idea of how policies overlap technical things, and they come together. And I do want to make a quick note that this isn't just in DoD. We have, if you're a large healthcare company, if you're a bank, if you're a multinational corporation, if you're a manufacturer, if you're working ports and unloading ships, there are regulatory or business constraints that are very similar to an ATO. So these processes equally apply in a lot of different places. But when you're talking about these layers, let's actually make it a little more concrete. Now you're talking about there's a standard for how do you harden an operating system for a VM. And that's one of those sets of controls of, password controls or what you allow for login or certain certificates for use. Or if you're in the federal US space, if you are using certificates, it means you're using encryption, which means you need to have proper FIPS libraries to go. So there's all these layers of how you use it. But if you think about the technical controls, you have the VM, you have, if you're going to put that VM into a set of systems, say a Kubernetes cluster or a Cloud Foundry cluster or whatever it might be, those are another layer. That's a platform layer. Then you have the layers of the applications themselves that run on them. And if it's going to be MySQL as a component, there's MySQL hardening. So each one of these components, there are technical controls for. And that's kind of what you're referring to, these layers, right? These different parts and how they fit together.
Yeah, absolutely. Because a lot of organizations, and again, they focus on 3 tiers, and even the old OSI model, right? It doesn't get quite as granular as we need to in a microservices-based architecture. The reality is, an application consists of, and was able to speak on this at another conference earlier in the week. It was an amazing discussion. But when you're talking application controls, you're really talking source code, data, runtime, middleware, the containers, the operating system, all of these layers. It's not enough just to say, hey, we're talking about an application as a generic term, because within all of those layers that I just mentioned, container has its own hardening guidance and it has its own requirements and services that it provides, such as encryption and authentication. Obviously there's the operating system that's huge in itself. A typical operating system has over 200 questions alone. Without getting too far into STIG checklists and those things, there are other resources that the DoD and probably sensitive industries that DMZ could chat about. There are numerous requirements that have to be met. And so just an operating system alone has hundreds of questions that have to be answered to do a proper configuration from a security and compliance perspective.
So
let's break that down real quick, because there's one of the things, and Mark finds the mad developer himself. He says this is a great story, shrinking that compliance checklist from I think he said 1,600 down to 38 questions. That's huge. What does this mean in terms of how long it takes to get the application out to production? I've got to guess that this can cut weeks, months off when you're able to do this. Is that correct?
Absolutely. One thing to remember, that part of the struggle and why compliance sometimes doesn't have the best reputation is an ATO can take as long as 18 months or more.
Wow.
When you do that legacy approach, and it's painful. And when you incorporate the benefits that we're talking about, I've seen a customer using some of the tools. And by the way, I realized I didn't even introduce my title here is a modern compliance architect. Our job is to do innovation in compliance and help shape customer perspective and empower them to do this quicker. We have done that. We've had one customer be able to deploy something in less than 3 days using some of the tools and templates that we have available in conjunction, with a fantastic solution architect team. But we've seen a Tanzu deployment occur effectively less than a week with the complete production push in 72 hours. And one of the things that was even more monumental, one of those checklists that I mentioned a moment ago, a STIG checklist, has 286 questions centered around a Tanzu ecosystem. We were able to use that to get the 286 questions down to 12 in the same day of the deployment. And then within, I want to say, another 12 hours, they had resolved the 12 questions that were left.
Wow.
Wow.
And we're talking DoD apps, right? We're talking military, we're talking federal.
DoD.
This isn't, when we talk critical apps, I'm guessing that these applications aren't just, how do I log my time card? These are things that affect our national defense. It affects our government. When we talk critical apps, this is the epitome of that, right?
It absolutely is. And one of the things that, again, I'm grateful to work with such a fantastic team, but we're very passionate about teaching. We recognize the fact that part of our role is teaching. I just within the last couple of years, I went through an assessment with a team. How long has cloud been relevant? I've went through an accreditation just in the last 2 years with an experienced DoD team that had not even done a cloud assessment before. So one of the first things we do is often accept the fact, that's cloud, not to mention microservices. So when a team shows up to evaluate something like a Cloud Foundry ecosystem with the application, the easiest way to approach it often is just to start with a simple briefing and walk them through and kind of get familiarization with the team. So I say all that, it's a credit. We have tremendous teams that we've worked with, But a lot of times it goes much smoother if we just put our teaching hat on from the very beginning and recognize that we're going to, it might be a little bit of time up front, but it's so much better when we teach, when we just walk these organizations through our perspective on this. And going back to the example I shared with the military, by taking that perspective and being patient and kind and empathetic to our customer and trying to really meet them where they're at, that's what did it. We were able to then help them understand and have confidence and our confidence in our competence, right? But help them to understand where we were coming from, and that we really did understand the ATO process. We weren't trying to sneak something by or give unvalidated answers, but really give them confidence in our solution and in our approach.
And Chris, this is, if you think of ATO though, this is yes, U.S. federal. You're talking about a lot of that, but this is a process across almost any large organization, European or in Asia or anywhere else where you have governments, organizations that are working with these things. And I think you had an interesting challenge there, is that while some parts of, these are massive organizations. Think of the size of the U.S. military, the federal government, and the size of where they have, there are bases around the globe. They need to connect things in and around, but they have the added constraint that not everything can be just use Amazon. You can't just go to Amazon to make it work. So you have parts of these organizations that are highly technical. They know the latest and greatest things, but because of the size, like you mentioned, there are so many that don't know that.
Right.
And that's kind of even shaping, like the idea of a continuous ATO 5 years ago wasn't there. The idea of automation and standardization and immutable environments and immutable images, and the idea of having these consistent building blocks that you could inherit and say, I can guarantee that the next time I deploy this, it's going to match the same controls because of the immutability and the automation around it. That wasn't there in many places. So, I think that's not only changing, but the people are recognizing the tools that are available for that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the challenges, there's a lot of excitement around automation and microservices, and rightly so. Right, there should be, because anything that can reduce the toil and the manual labor should be embraced. However, I think a lot of teams are starting to realize that continuous authorization as a concept, I want to say, started around 2019, where it was formally documented. And so many teams immediately rushed into this idea that they could fully automate the ATO process. And I'll tell you, the latest DoD guidance from this year, I think there's one draft and 2 documents that were published, both an evaluation criteria and implementation guidance for CATO. And so it is still positive. It is still worthy of achieving. A continuous ATO is still highly automated. However, there's already been recognition that there are several hundred unique controls and things that need to be met, because too many teams, I think, focused on the automation and focused on application analysis, but they didn't think far enough ahead into how the application actually interacts with the environment that it's deployed in, which comes right back to what is the benefit of something like Cloud Foundry. And I think, David, you kind of alluded to this. Something might be deployed in one manner and meet technical controls in, let's say, an AWS infrastructure, but does that mean it's going to be deployed the same way in an Azure, or a GCP? Not necessarily, unless you have a consistent infrastructure that's shared across those systems,
or even 2 Amazon environments. You could have 2 people.
You're totally right. Yes.
Yeah.
And we'll bring up another question from Fines here, and I'm going to expand on this a little bit and get y'all's opinion. But he asked, how do you view the BOSH layer versus the CF layer in compliance work? When we look at the foundation, to kind of expand on this question, we've got the BOSH layer that works as the orchestration. It's what gets our virtual hardware out there. It's what makes, it is the infrastructure on which we run on. But then we've got the CF layer, where we bring in things like our hardened stem cells, the base OSs that we use for our containers. Those are things that are very hardened. These two work together. How does that impact the compliance work that you're seeing in on ATO? Meaning, kind of bringing in a term here that we use quite a bit, secure by nature, when we talk about the platform. What does that mean to you guys when it comes to compliance work?
Well, I want to jump in first. We were talking a little bit about this one. This is one of those areas that I it's a nuance of words. It's like
totally
how do you approach this? And the way I approach this when I'm talking to customers, or even just talking to people in general, surprisingly, you can imagine me getting with a group of people and technically talking security things all night over beers. That is, yes, something I do on a regular basis. But if you think about this, we've said in the industry, secure by default forever. But what does that really mean in practice? And Chris will back this up, because you've done a lot of ATOs in space where you have to actually really document as well. Is in the past it was, oh, well, you have a product, whatever it might be, say it doesn't matter what it is, and then you have the vendor's best practices. And the two of those aren't really aligned. You have to then take their best practice and you have to implement it so it can become secure by default. What I prefer to focus on is default secure. Those environments that are shipped with security controls by default, say a stem cell image that is hardened to CIS and STIG standards. You don't have to do anything. It is shipped that way by default. Now you can do additional things to it, like adding a banner, like DoD requires a banner. There's certain things you need to do to tune that to meet your certain customized environments, but by default, you ship it with minimal packages. You ship it with those default secure configurations out of the box. That's a little nuance of words, by the way I look at that, and I'll let Chris get his 2 cents in after I've.
Yeah, no, I absolutely, and I appreciate that. From a compliance standpoint, I actually just had a similar conversation about this earlier, but it is absolutely critical that we start by identifying what the requirements are for an environment. The very first step in RMF, risk management framework, is categorizing the system, right? So we start by saying, what are we protecting? What is this system ultimately? What is the risk level of this system ultimately going to be? So the reason I started with that is because that then helps us shape, and it leads into the conversation of what STIGs, what hardening guidance needs to be applied. So to the BOSH question, a lot of times we'll see BOSH treated as, we'll apply what's called the virtual machine manager, SRG, or if it's Ubuntu.
Can you define SRG for
Yes,
those that don't know?
thank you. Great call out. Security requirements guide.
Okay.
So this, as the kind of, again, overarching DoD Tier 1, has for years now published checklists that do depend on the manufacturer. So we'll just say server as an example. So Microsoft is expected to, I believe quarterly is the rhythm right now. Maybe it's 45 days. But at least quarterly provide any updates based on patches, based on modifications, based on changes that have been done to whether it's an OS, an application, cyber defense tool. There's something like 600 of these STIGs and SRGs. So for everything, so for BOSH, for instance, we might use the virtual machine SRG. And then let's say there's an Ubuntu image, we would apply one called the container platform. In Cloud Foundry, for that matter, we'll have the container platform SRG provided, which is kind of the overarching guidance to how to secure a container. So for us, BOSH versus Cloud Foundry is kind of dependent on how it's being implemented, but typically what we actually see BOSH kind of more as a management layer versus an orchestration. And I know there's nuances to words, right? Like DMZ said that, he's totally correct. But this goes back to why it's so critical to know the risk level of the environment, what it's going to be, and then to know the role of each piece of that infrastructure. Because then that's how we in turn then explain to the customer and sell this whole infrastructure to them. Because you can imagine compliance can get very complex very fast. And so the more transparent we are at the beginning and the more we explain our architecture, the more comfortable the customer will be with something that's generally new to them.
Mm-hmm. Let me think about that one for a second. I think so. Chris mentioned there that they have to document changes, which means if you have an upgrade to a stem cell or a build pack, and they're primarily capturing compliance changes or security changes. So what vulnerabilities are patched, what vulnerabilities are introduced, that kind of changes things in there. Now, picture you have a Cloud Foundry environment and you're updating your stem cell every 2 weeks. We have a couple of customers we know that do that. Now, how do you document that? So this isn't just federal space. I have multiple banks who have asked me, how do I report to my internal regulation team, the internal risk officers, as well as to my regulators, whichever region they're in? We're doing a change every 2 weeks, and they have to document changes to the systems that are critical to business. It's under DORA, it's under FFIEC. There's other banking requirements. Other industries have similar things. And how do you document that? How do you have knowledge and visibility to view that? And I want to just throw a little shout out. If we have anyone listening today who is a Tanzu Vanguard, join next week's meeting. We're going to dive into a couple of conversations on that one. But
shout out to the Vanguards, important group. If you're not a member, you should take a look at it, because that is a very important group.
Yeah, and the phrasing, I can't say which customer it was here publicly, but it was a large bank that basically was asking, how do we have that regulatory easy button? It's not a process, it's a documentation thing. Like Chris was talking about ATO in the federal government. This is how to use a large enterprise. You have servers around the globe serving millions of customers. How do you make changes? You have to do a heavily documented, here's the change I'm going to make, here's how I back it out, here's how I'm going to test it. And part of that is, and what's driving that is, I'm patching these things. And how do you go through and gather that? And having these immutable building blocks, it's easy to say, I'm on this version, going to this version, here are the changes I'm looking at. And then it's going to get easier, I think, over the next few months too, which I'll share to anyone who joins me next week.
Well, and there's another important point there that we kind of glossed over, which is you talked about, you had a customer that hadn't even done a cloud assessment. When we talk about Cloud Foundry, it is a platform as a service. It abstracts away the infrastructure that it sits on. That is something that I see as a key benefit as we start talking about finances and costs. You've got your bean counters in the company that may want you to go to, AWS one day, it may be in the data center another. How do we have that portability? Well, with the platform as a service, since we extract away all that stuff and it kind of sits almost like a data center in a box, you kind of have a little bit of certainty that if I move this to a different cloud, if I move it to a different infrastructure, it's going to operate in much the same way because the stem cells, the stacks that we use, those things don't change. It gives you a lot of portability, and it kind of lets the bean counters and cost also play a factor in where you may put your applications without having to worry about reducing security.
Yeah, I've told a lot of security teams, because this is a problem. You look at somebody who's like, oh, we've got 3,000 VMs. We've got to figure out how do we manage our risk. We have all these, policies around how we do this. And the conversation usually shifts when I say, imagine it's an appliance. I'm sure the federal government has similar, what's the SRG for an appliance versus the SRG of a VM-based approach? It's a different way of approaching it. The controls generally map a little bit differently and it does function like an appliance. You have one input that says, here's my state I want it to be, and Bosch goes, cool, I'll do that for you.
Yeah, and the implications are really astounding, because I can tell you that most assessors already, when you have, again, a kind of legacy approach, we'll say a gold image, right? You have a standard server deployment that is done. Again, this is pre really our conversation, but even then, there was a minimum metric that had to be done. I think 15% for servers. And so most assessors already understand the concept that if you have a single image that's deployed numerous places in the infrastructure, it's acceptable to do, some assessors will only do one. So imagine the implications here. If you have a Cloud Foundry instance and it's shared even across different CSPs, there'll still be some due diligence done. But I think most assessors, once the light bulb goes off and they understand fully the implications of what we're saying, they'll be much more amenable to doing a lower number of assessment. Just a lower number of evaluations. The scope of it will shift. It'll decrease, and it'll be much easier, and again, much better received.
And a lot quicker, because now we're just looking at, hey, we've certified the platform. What's changed if we move to Google or we move to a data center, a different data center? We only really need to certify the things that are underlying, not the whole platform again, which again, going back to that 18 months, you can greatly speed up, what you're able to deploy and what you're able to get out there. And again, take that cost into consideration.
Well, even for the changes, there are a couple other organizations I've worked with that in the ops man world, you have the manifest that comes from that, but in the end, it really comes down to your Bosch manifest. That actually defines your environment, and they actually will monitor those configurations for changes. So if you have a new feature, like when you roll out a new Cloud Foundry, you're going to have more Bosch environment variables that are managing those new features. So they can capture changes just by monitoring that one point versus having to go look at 400 servers. So it really makes that much easier.
Well, and touching on continuous ATO, I mentioned this a few minutes ago. There's several hundred controls that are just tied to continuous authorization, and the reason for that is, again, these are newer concepts. Things like SBOM, and Vex, Cyclone DX integration, all of these tools that we use to actually understand the dependencies that are being used in an environment. These are new concepts, not just in the DoD, but still, I think, in the commercial world. I think it's safe to say, I obviously been around a few years, but still new, and things that we don't quite understand the compliance implications of sometimes. And so the better that again, putting that teaching hat on, the better that we understand it as consultants and as service providers, the better we're able to engage our customers and help them understand all of the different goodness and the capabilities that we offer.
Well, I want to throw out one quick thing, since I see you read it on the chat here. There's a question on SBOMs. It's like the industry as a whole is going, we see the benefit, but how are people using this? And that is a teaching moment for you, as you mentioned. Read if you happen to have that blog handy, we actually had a vulnerability in the last few weeks that came out because of Samba. For those who are paying attention to the Samba bug that came out, and how did we internally use our SBOMs to go through all of our products and find out where were we vulnerable potentially or not. And we have a blog post we did on that one to really share how we use the process ourselves and how we're looking to eventually incorporate some of those, and how you as consumers of Cloud Foundry would use the similar process to know at which of these many layers a vulnerability might be impacted and how and where you would update those.
And that is also a great point. I mean, SBOMs are kind of one of the new keywords that are out there. And yeah, SBOMs are great. You know what's in your system, but just having that listing doesn't do you a lot of good if you're not doing something with it. And I think that's where, especially for me, some of the education needs to come in is, okay, I've got this listing of all my dependencies and stuff, but how do I make the best use of that to make sure that I'm secure, right? If I'm not looking at my SBOMs, if I'm not, continuously looking to see how I can do updates or what I need to do there, it's just another piece of paper that's filling the void, right? You got to bring a process around it. And I would love to get y'all's take on, kind of ideas of where SBOMs can help and what y'all's recommendations are for SBOMs. Software bill of materials, by the way, for anybody that doesn't know.
And I think I got the blog up there.
Yeah, that was that one. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. Was it the one that starts out with talking about the cups that we're not? Okay.
That was that one. Yeah. And actually, SBOMs, there's a couple of different things on that one. I'll let Chris dive into because the U.S. federal government is kind of, we knew SBOMs were there, but the U.S. federal government is the first to really call out the fact that they knew that we needed to gather that, and they kind of made a mandate, and they've been spending some time figuring out, well, what does that really mean to now mandate these sort of things? But it's starting to show up in other places. Like, as we knew, DORA just came out for those who are paying attention to anything in Europe, and DORA itself has SBOM it's a third-party dependent partner type of relationship. And I've even seen customers ask within the contract to revise contracts to include the ability to have SBOMs. And with that, Nick, is the other critical part is, well, what is just having an inventory is one thing, but I can give you an SBOM for Cloud Foundry, but that doesn't reflect the dozen or so different services that are deployed. The SBOM for the Cloud Controller is different from the SBOM for the UA service. But if I give you one SBOM across the whole thing, how do you relate this? How does it tie to the different product components? And how are those packaged together? I think that's still being figured out in a lot of ways. But we internally also have a lot of research we're doing on the vulnerabilities that come in our products and how do we tie those. And SBOM is just one part of it. There's also the SPDX or Cyclone DX or tracking of known vulnerabilities and triage details around that is just as important. And there's a need internally within Broadcom, but also in the industry to start figuring out, well, what do we do with this? And I expect over the next 2 years, we're going to see a lot more actual consumption of these SBOMs. And once if imagine you're a company, or the DoD, and you're using a third-party product, whatever it might be. It could be Kubernetes, it could be your Cloud Foundry. You have an SBOM. Well, what do you do with it? Once you start looking at that data, you can just load it into Trivy and scan and go, I've got all these vulnerabilities. Well, what does that do for you? That next side of the question is I think the really interesting part of where we're going with this continuous compliance is this is just one step of the documentation. And Chris and I were talking earlier, the data, this is the data for the foundation, just like the data for any ETO environment is going to be driven by what's the data set you're working with, who has access to it. And these are similar questions that we can give you an SBOM, but what does that mean? How do you do anything with it? And we are going to have to teach people, here's an SBOM, but this is what it means.
Yep. I've got an inventory of parts, but what do those parts mean? And when I look at my inventory, I got an inventory of car parts, but I also see that I've got, a bunch of parts for a tractor trailer. I don't need those, right? So, another way to kind of go through and use those is, are we actually using all of the software that's in our bill of materials? And if it's not, is it something that we can remove? Because that lowers our blast radius, that lowers our attack vector. That's one of those examples I'm thinking about. But going back to your point, yeah, having an inventory doesn't do you a lot of good if you're not reviewing the inventory and checking to make sure it's correct. And Chris, love to get your take on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the challenge is that the DoD traditional model of evaluating that one component in that inventory goes back to that application security STIG with 286 questions. Well, imagine if you had to evaluate every dependency, third-party library,
Right.
every component of that SBOM with that STIG. It's impossible. I mean, frankly, it's impossible especially for a complex software system. So, I know what a lot of my customers are doing, and again, the benefit of having at least an established infrastructure, with Cloud Foundry and some of the other components we use on a regular basis, is we know the security capability that's been built in, because from a software engineering standpoint, it is understood and accepted that you won't be able to do source code scan, for instance, on every single dependency. There are tools and there are resources that are needed sometimes where you won't be able to apply the level of scrutiny that the DoD typically prefers. But with an SBOM, you can at least identify every component in that. In a sense, it's replacing the current ATO requirement is a hardware software list. And so immediately over the last few years, we run into the challenge of, okay, well, what do you put on the software list? You put all of those libraries, you put the dependencies, and more it's shifting under continuous ATO to where the SBOM is where that is captured. So we can make a separation that hardware software traditional list is everything that has a checklist applied, the STIG, the SRG, all of those known resources, and then everything that's under the SBOM, we at least then can separate those two out, and the SBOM will have a different security process applied, but it's not going to be 286 questions per item. It's going to be at a minimum scans. If we can do source code analysis, fantastic. But we will at least identify who the developer is. So most of my federal, I can't think of a single one that doesn't. They at least want to know some history of that dependency. Where was it developed, right? Was it developed in China, versus a Five Eyes country is typically the metric. So, yeah, I mean, there's a whole long conversation that could be had here. But bottom line is, from the DoD perspective, they need to at least know something, and that's where the SBOM comes in. Is it gives you that basic minimum, hopefully plus more security features, and like David mentioned, you might be the ability to run a Trivy scan and actually do CVE analysis. But it's understood that we're not going to do this old approach of nearly 300 questions for every single dependency anymore.
Well, let's shift directions a little bit. So we're talking about how the platform, the platform as a service helps with the security. It's secure by default. But the other aspect of this is not only what your applications are going on, but ongoing maintenance, right? And I want to bring up, there was a great talk done by, I believe, Justin Smith back in like 2015, 2016 at one of the Cloud Foundry summits around the 3 R's: repair, repave, and rotate. And he kind of challenged a lot of the security aspects in that talk. It was a great talk, and we'll put the link down in the show notes below. I encourage everybody to go watch it because I think it's still relevant today. But one of the benefits of the platform and the way that we do things is we kind of take some of those security aspects of, hey, we're watching for things that might be going wrong, or we're watching for things that are malevolent that are out there in our infrastructure, and kind of turning that on its head and saying, hey, what happens if we take a lifespan of a VM down to a day or 3 days? Something that, if an attacker does get in, they've got a very limited time frame. And I think that's one of the benefits of a platform that we don't talk about enough is security goes beyond just how secure the platform is, but how do you maintain it? How do you go through and, malware and ransomware are huge threats nowadays, right? That's something a lot of people are worried about. This ability to repave or repair and rotate on a whim's notice with no downtime, huge aspects in my view. Would love to get y'all's opinion on that, especially from the Fed space or from something like a bank.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, well, and please, steer me straight if I'm not capturing the full context of what you're saying. But this is one of the reasons I do love working in the DoD. Again, 2,000 questions, right? Up to 2,000 questions for an authorization. But the beauty of it is that those 2,000 questions do capture things like cyber awareness training. They capture personal responsibility. They capture resources for insider threat. For many, you have the right to say something is not applicable when you're doing a DoD authorization. But for the most part, all of the things that you mentioned in your question, they're included in the scope of a DoD authorization. So when we talk about patching, the ability to spin up a new VM at a moment's notice, or in cloud, the ability to restore in a rapid manner. All of those things are encompassed in a DoD authorization, which comes right back to the inheritable controls. That's why what we're offering through Cloud Foundry and through this capability in the cloud is so crucial, and it needs to be taught and explained. I know I've said it a few times, right? But the more I think that customers understand that this is way beyond just everybody's seen the simple chart that shows IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, and the different responsibilities. But again, it doesn't get granular enough to make sense a lot of times. But what we're offering is phenomenal in that ability and that redundancy. So help me out if there's something I missed, or DMZ, feel free to jump back in.
It's repaving, and this idea of constantly doing updates is only gathering more. And if we go back to our conversation a few weeks ago around CrowdStrike, the idea we're always continuously releasing software. It's never changing. We're going to always have releases. In fact, I was having a thread with someone earlier today around the idea that, we have releases sometimes multiple times a week. So one of the first questions I asked anyone I'm talking to around being able to do any of this, if you're going to go toward automation or any of these solutions that may make this consistency work, is how often are you able to receive an upgrade? Are you able to do an upgrade twice a week, once a month? Or is the control constraints around what you're doing require you to actually only do it once a quarter or twice a year? How easily can you consume this? And it turns out that a lot of people are afraid of doing upgrades because, oh my God, my app might go down. Well, that's an app architecture problem. That's not a platform problem. We have those mechanisms. So we've seen, CrowdStrike didn't, they didn't update. It caused significant issues. They discovered in their lessons learned, canary updates and blue-green deployments. Hey, that's part of our repaving process. When you repave Cloud Foundry, it'll actually take the new update, because we've done the rapidly patching, of things. We've done that, and another repaving the environment. It builds out a new system. If it has a failure, if a canary fails, it stops. So the building blocks are just as relevant, and other industries are recognizing all those pieces, to have the blue-green deployments, to have the canary deployments if things fail. How do you roll things back? How do you go forward? And those are just as critical. And making the decision of this is really driven by compliance of ATO, or within banking or PCI spaces. You have to do these risk analyses and say, what's the risk? I have to do an upgrade once a month because there's all these critical vulnerabilities. Well, how do we do that if it's going to take the business offline for 4 hours or 10 hours? How do we handle that? And that really turns into a separate conversation of how have we architected our applications and the data that goes with them, because data is usually constrained. That persistent data store is usually what prevents you from rotating an environment. It's like, oh, I can't unmount that data. It's like petabytes of data. Well, how are you architecting the access to that data? What's the access requirements around it? And then the applications, this is a bigger picture conversation of how are you using these platforms, and are you able to take advantage of the automation and inheritance built into it to do those 3R operations? And if you're in Kubernetes, you have similar controls, but Cloud Foundry is just much more opinionated about how it does it, and it's much more consistent. But it comes down to how well can you as a business receive those continuous updates and process it in your environment? And some of those are bigger questions than the platform itself.
Yeah, and can I just real quick add on,
Mm-hmm.
David, what you're getting into, fundamental cybersecurity concept, CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, and availability goes right back to that data type. You mentioned the bank, or let's say you're a hospital, supporting live medical procedures. Availability is critical, and there are security controls that define that. You'll go in again. You'll categorize the system. You figure out what data requirements are there, and then that's going to determine that availability requirement. If you're high availability, but better have a solution that's able to spin back up rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
And we have the similar constraint. We are trying to release Cloud Foundry and stem cells commercially, so we have to also, as part of a corporation, which we're part of a bigger corporation of Broadcom. They have their own policies and their own constraints about how and when we patch the vulnerabilities in the product, and how do we get those validated, vetted, and detailed and out the door for us to get to our customers, and then how do they receive that data? This is, we're all in this together. It's a very big chain of phone conversations and helping each other lift up and share that data. And that inheritance model is very well seen in a vendor partner relationship, where people are providing different parts of those building blocks, and how you put them together. And that's an interesting part of that story, is how do we put those together?
Yep. I want to dig in more into that, but Nick looks like he's chomping at the bit to ask a question.
Yeah.
So.
Well, no, I've got an observation of, like, we had to talk about the 3 R's, and I would say that repave is probably, the most important R, or something to talk about, because now I've done the PCI compliance and some of the high tech HIPAA compliance and things. I haven't done any of these federal, taken anything through federal yet, because I worked, on a non-federal side. But and shout out to Rita's comment of, like, the acronyms, because, like, there are many acronyms this show that I had to look up too, just so I'm learning just with everyone else. But I would think that the checklist is probably much longer on the federal side of requirements, but they're similar. But when I talk about, like, or when you talk about repaving, like, when we was always going through, like going into a security team, like trying to get let's say Cloud Foundry approved within a certain, like, retail organization, the other alternative to VMs were like, well, these are long-lived VMs that, you know, have been around for years. But then like it was almost like the concept of Repave like broke all the security constraints, because like, what do you mean it's just going to rebuild every week? Well, we want to run a long-lived like maintenance software. Like, why? It's going to die. It's going to be gone. It's going to break all the security tools. So like, I think that is still like this really powerful concept to talk about, and I see it kind of probably is applicable in all spaces.
I 100% agree with you. And that was kind of the part that I wanted to dig in. You brought it up perfectly, Nick, right? Yes, updating and upgrading your software is very important. You got to keep ahead of those things. But what happens when you do have, you know, working hand in hand, you do have one of your monitors pop up and show that there's a bad actor, happening on one of your VMs, or in the case of CloudStrike, something, you know, went out there and it installed something that you didn't want it to. Well, that's where the ability of Repave I see is one of those superpowers that we hear Tim Leong always talk about. You know, when it comes to Bosch Recreate is a superpower because, you know, we can take that VM, we could kick it out, and we can bring it back up from a known good. We're going to end up getting new credentials. We're going to get new IDs, all of that stuff. It is a new VM, but it's still holding the same, you know, kind of underlying workloads that were on there with no downtime. And I think that's an incredibly powerful thing. And it's one of those things that I think Cloud Foundry, you know, it's built into the stack. It's built into the architecture. And it's something that, you know, going back to Justin's talk, he said that, you know, one of the things that used to be a source of pride in companies is, hey, look, it's been 888 days since I've had to reboot this VM. That's a horrible idea, right? That is something that is just, and security guys should be losing their minds if we say something like that. Well, let's take that concept. Even if there's nothing wrong, you know, some of these bad actors are very sneaky. They're hard to see. What if we just kind of take away that and we just rebuild once a week? I think it was Wells Fargo that said they wanted to get to a point where they repaved once a day or something to that effect. I can't remember the exact talk, but this seems like, you know, security in force. Very hard for you to, you know, break into my house and pick my lock if I'm always changing my locks, right? So.
I do want to throw out there that the repair part of that doesn't necessarily, you know, the 3 R's don't apply to, hey, you go do your 3 R's. The repair part of them to repave means that we, as their vendor or Cloud Foundry is open source, is providing the repairing of that system so they can repave. So let's not forget that applies in multi-layers, and the credential rotation is humongous. But Chris, if you want to just spend a second talking about how the repaving has helped, I totally agree with that.
And here comes James Waters in. Absolutely agree. Repave every 14 days. Great minimum bar. I think it's something that all companies should be looking at. And this is one of those things that comes with the power of a platform, in my opinion. And yes, people talk about, well, Cloud Foundry is very opinionated. It is, but it's that opinionation that gives us the ability to do these types of things with no downtime. You know, when you have a lot of flexibility, you also have a lot of work, right? With great flexibility comes great options, and great options comes great risk. So,
but those strongly opinionated views also allow it to have that new tagline. It just runs.
It just runs.
The idea that you can get 200,000 containers across thousands of VMs and rebuild the environment in a couple of days, you know, and that couple of days isn't you constraining it. It's the fact that disks only spin so fast. So you get a large enough environment, it just takes time, and you want to make sure it's going to properly canary deploy those thousands of instances to a point where, as you mentioned, Wells Fargo, go watch those videos if y'all haven't seen them. The idea that you can say, you know, in a banking environment, I'm going to do a rebuild of my entire foundation in the middle of the business day. That makes everybody go, whoa, how are you doing that? And the stories that you hear when you watch that, he's like, when he's on board, you know, the first time you onboarded it, that was like Chris is describing. This is a very complex, detailed documentation process. You're going through this, and, you know, I worked at Wells Fargo decades ago. The idea that you have someone who spent weeks designing something, and then you have a call with 60, 70 people on the call with 2 engineers doing the work. The rest are just the man reporting the status across these calls, and they're at 3 a.m. And that's just the way you did changes in banks. You had 2 windows during the week. You'd have one on the weekend, one in the middle of the week. But now, you know, when Wells was saying in the stories that, you know, when he started onboarding his 50th or 100th product, and they're like, oh, when's your change window? He goes, oh, we just finished. You know, think how powerful that is as a business to say, when the next Log4j comes, you know, you're not going to have tech debt. Tech debt is not free. You know, the idea that we're not going to patch means you're going to have an expensive patch later. And if you've not designed your applications to run properly on a platform like this, and you can't do upgrades, we need to solve that. But if you have, the idea when Log4j comes and we say we've got mitigation within hours or a patch within less than a day, how do you apply that? How do you consume that repaving process that we patched for you? And that's where I think this is just where the star just shines. It just runs.
Yeah. I just want to state, I don't know if anybody else heard it, but when we started talking about repaving, rebuilding VMs, change managers across the world, their heads just exploded, right?
Yeah.
This is it's almost, the technology is there. We can prove it can be done, but there's also a process and culture shift that's got to come with companies to adopt some of those practices. And, part of that is proving out that it can work. Chris, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, my apology. 2 quick things. David mentioned Log4j, and that's a fantastic example. One of the customers I worked with, it was a DoD service and operating TAS. Log4j comes out. I can't remember if it was a Thursday or Friday, but the DoD component made the release Monday afternoon. Everybody has 72 hours to get compliant with Log4j. That TAS customer had done it that morning. So literally the DoD memo came out with the timeline to remediate, and the customer had already done it because they were using TAS. And so, when we talk about things like Bosch Recreate and some of these capabilities, more and more, again, putting that teaching hat on, I'm trying to teach my customers to really just look at risk, right? Don't have a reaction, don't have a fear reaction, because a lot of times the legacy approach in the DoD, due to the complexity of the architecture, again, all the way up to tier 1, is just disconnect. If a critical vulnerability comes out, we don't know how to respond to it, just disconnect from the network. And that's not the right answer for many of these systems. And so that ability to whether it's through Bosch Recreate or whatever capability we're using in our infrastructure, that ability to just go back to a less risky version or to properly understand the risk, even to process whether it's a false positive or whether there's no impact, focusing on risk itself, not just compliance, checklist and that legacy approach matters, and it helps our customer have value.
And I want to throw out one more thing, not just repaving. Let's also remember the restaging, because there are going to be both pro packs and stack updates on a regular basis. How well are you receiving those? The idea that we can repave and not impact an application, that's huge. I mean, that's enormously huge in itself, that it doesn't change the app. But the idea that you have the same practices that you can apply to the application layer, just make that, those layers easier to process. I saw the question here from Mark.
So how do we position frequent repaving? Maybe is this APT mitigation control? Can we use it to make life easier? I mean, I'm going to give from an operations, Nick, you probably got an opinion on this as well. Yes, it is one of those ways to repave. I think that if you believe you might have bad actors, you believe you may have credentials that were leaked, this is a way to get rid of that. But just from an infrastructure balance point of view, one of the reasons that I did repaving was, at the end of the week before Monday started, I would go through and repave all my Diego cells just to make sure that all my applications are balanced across my Diegos. It's a great way to do that from an operational standpoint, but from a security standpoint, Nick, anybody on the panel, do you have any additional thoughts here on why repaving might be a good idea?
Well, I mean, obviously the benefit of if reducing the uptime of a certain machine and getting it fresh, so like if someone were to get in, they would lose that door. But that is a good point. We often talk about repave from a security aspect, but not just. Well, yeah, it's also good to repave like your Diego cells, because especially you have a large environment, they're seeing a lot of churn of containers going up and down, and just repaving, recreating VMs may, even on the back end, free up some memory on your hypervisors of just like memory that was allocated, and then you can clear out too. So there's even like lower level infrastructure benefits as well of just cycling your VMs and like cleaning up, doing some housekeeping, so to speak, too. So
memory leaks, resource getting locked. Yep.
Not that we ever see that still, because we write good software nowadays, right? So it's
well, I mean, I had some issues with my home lab. I had some hosts go down yesterday, and I ended up which caused some storage issues. So I ended up like recycling all my foundations, and that actually I need to start repaving in my home lab to free up some memory, because just the fact of powering all the VMs off and on again, which you would see in a repave as they get shut off and rebuilt, the core ESXi hypervisor layer got a bunch of memory free because it was just like memory that had been used but then never released back to the hypervisor. So that's another benefit too.
Yeah, memory like tech debt is not free.
Yeah. So it's always good to reboot the things every now and then, right? Or rebuild them from scratch. So lots of benefits there.
As long as it's not cattle, that's the whole point of this whole conversation is it just runs. It does what it needs to do. And if it, I love the idea of chaos engineering. In fact, that'd be a great conversation. Another future episode is how can we introduce the idea of chaos engineering into a Cloud Foundry environment, and the idea that you're intentionally disrupting you're taking your stick out and going, you die over here. And because realistically, in the end, you want the point of all of these is to make sure you have it goes back to what Chris mentioned, the risk-based approach, the idea that you're now analyzing the risks of not just the vulnerabilities, but the way the environment is deployed and run and managed, and all of that tied together of what's the risk to you as a business and your customers for using these platforms, and how do we use these processes to reduce that risk. And repaving an environment, it does all these technical benefits, but it also, if you have a practice of having an environment that can go down, again, the chaos engineering tied to it, you have an application that's robust enough to do what you need to do as a business. Now, if that's important to you, are you in the DoD where a mission means you're sending planes or tanks out somewhere and people's lives are on the line? You kind of want to make sure that it's going to run. And if you actually turn a system off, Chris, good question for the DoD. On any of, say, a tank systems or an airplane systems or the places you may have worked in when you were in the force, how many backup systems do they have? Is it just one, or is it made intentionally designed for failure?
I do want to jump in real quick. So Chris, I know you've got another appointment here at the top of the hour. Do you have enough time to answer that question?
I do, and I've actually worked on the systems, some of the systems that David has talked about. One of my roles was as a tactical air traffic controller, and so I won't go into too much more detail beyond that. But yes, suffice it to say, there are not backups, which is one of the, as I've transitioned to this role, that's the beauty again of containerization, and these rapid response capabilities that we have. So yes, hopefully that answers that question. But yeah, no, it's. Modernization has done wonders for the DoD, and I'm excited to be a part of it.
Excellent. All right. Well, I know, again, I know, Chris, we've got to let you go. You've got another webinar that's coming up. One thing I do want to say, I want to thank the audience. We had a lot of great conversation in the audience today. Thank you very much for that. For all of y'all that are watching, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. We want to let you know anytime things are coming out. Make sure you pay attention to us on, LinkedIn. You got Nick, you got myself. I'll start posting my Twitter account that's out there now if anybody wants to take a look at that. But cloudfoundryweekly.com, LinkedIn, Twitter, and then we'll put the show notes on there. We'll put some of these links that were in the chat today in those show notes so people can get them easily. But wanted to thank you, Chris, for coming in because I know we're going to lose you here soon.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. And actually, I believe we have Rita on the line. I think she's going to share the link, but it is open. We're going to be doing a session on Go Fast and Be More Secure, lessons learned from the biggest breaches of 2024. And so we actually have a senior analyst from Forrester who did deep dive into application breaches. So I think she's going to share the link in a moment. But thanks so much for having me on the show. This has been an absolute blast. Love this conversation. So thanks so much.
Yeah, great conversation. And, we'll probably get you back on here again because we go into the DMZ with DMZ quite regularly.
DMZ.
So recurring segment here on the show. So Nick, I'll let you take us out of here, man.
Yeah. So thanks again for joining. And if you haven't seen the show before, we typically end the show with a CF BY. So we'll do a countdown, 3, 2, 1 CF BY, and then we'll end it. So and then don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel to get notifications when we go live. Another call out there. And shout out to Dobbs. Always love seeing you. All right. So 3, 2, 1. CF BY.
CF BY.
CF BY.